Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. Today's presentation is um, probably a little bit different than what you've seen before, and reason for that is this. I mean, we're in a heck of a time in this country and the world, but I came across some information that I said, "Oh, I got to share this." And what it was this. Um, Coretta Scott King said, this was years after Martin was killed. She said they didn't kill my Martin over I Have a Dream. They killed my Martin over The Other America. And I vaguely recalled uh, Martin Luther King mentioning The Other America in some speeches later, but I didn't realize until I went and searched for it that he had a whole series of speeches that dealt with, as he called it, the other America. And what I want to do is present some of his other America um, speeches. What I'm going to do today, since this is part one, I'm going to actually read some of a speech he gave on the other America out at Stanford University in 1967. And here's what I want you to do. I'm going to present, as I'm doing this, I'm not going to try and talk like Martin Luther King, because I'm not nearly that eloquent. But I will do my best to share his words in a way that we can all grasp what he was saying. And at the same time, I'm going to be presenting some graphics of Martin's life, and not in any particular order, just a lot of photos, including those, quite a few with Coretta with him. And what got me was that she was at a lot of marches and events with him. And so you really get a chance to see how much love there was between them. And we have to remind ourselves constantly, especially with younger people. Martin was 39 years old when he was murdered, when he was assassinated. 39. I have actually lived a whole generation past uh, his life, and we should not forget to see Martin was 39, Malcolm was 39, and what happens is those who control the media and write history, they always try to make our leaders and our revolutionaries seem much older. If you ask most young people, in fact, if you ask a lot of people who are even around, they have this picture of Martin in their heads that he was old. He wasn't old. He was 39 years old, 39 years young. And so I want to share that too as we go along. So if you can, if you like, you can put your screen on full screen and then just listen. And I may stop at certain points to reemphasize something that he says because these are words you never hear the media on Martin Luther King Day or during Black History Month. You never hear these speeches, never hear these words. It's coming from Martin Luther King Jr. because they didn't want us to know that the brother was militant as heck. All right. So this is from a speech he gave at Stanford University in 1967. There are so many problems facing our nation and our world that one could just take off anywhere. But I'd like to use as a subject from which to speak this afternoon the other America. I use this subject because there are literally two Americas. Uh-oh. Got to stop for a second. Okay, let me get this. Okay. Because there are literally two Americas. One America is beautiful for situation. And in a sense, this people who have food and material necessities for their bodies and culture and education for their minds and freedom and human dignity for their spirits. In this America, millions of people experience every day the opportunity of having life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in all their dimensions. And in this America, millions of young people grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. But tragically and unfortunately, there is another America. This other America has a daily ugliness about it that constantly transforms the ebulliency of hope into the fatigue of despair. In this America, millions of work starved men walk the streets daily in search of jobs that do not exist. In this America, millions of people find themselves living in rat infested, vermin filled slums. In this America, people are poor by the millions. They find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. In a sense, the greatest tragedy of this other America is what it does to little children. Little children in this other America are forced to grow up with clouds of inferiority forming every day in their little mental skies. And as we look at this other America, we see it as an arena of blasted hopes and shattered dreams. Many people of various backgrounds live in this other America. Some of Mexico finds himself living in a triple ghetto, a ghetto of race, a ghetto of poverty, a ghetto of human misery. So, what we are seeking to do in the civil rights movement is to deal with this problem, to deal with this problem of two Americas. We're seeking to make America one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, let me say that the struggle for civil rights and the struggle to make these two Americas one America is much more difficult today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. For about a decade or maybe 12 years, we've struggled all across the South in glorious struggles to get rid of legal, overt segregation and all of the humiliation that surrounded that system of segregation. In a sense, this was a struggle for decency. We could not go to a lunch counter in so many instances and get a hamburger or a cup of coffee. We could not make use of public accommodations. Public transportation was segregated, and often we had to sit in the back, and transportation within cities. We often had to stand over empty seats because sections were reserved for whites only. We did not have the right to vote in so many areas of the South, and the struggle was to deal with these problems. And certainly they were difficult problems. They were humiliating conditions. By the thousands, we protested these conditions. We made it clear that it was ultimately more honorable to accept jail cell experiences than to accept segregation and humiliation. By the thousands, students and adults decided to sit in at segregated lunch counters to protest conditions there. By when they were sitting at those lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and seeking to take the whole nation to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Many things were gained as a result of those years of struggle. In 1964, the Civil Rights Bill came into being after the Birmingham movement, which did a great deal to subpoena the conscience of a large segment of the nation to appear before the judgment seat of morality on the whole question of civil rights. After the Selma movement in 1965, we were able to get a voting rights bill. And all of these things represented strides. But we must see that in the struggle today is much more difficult. It's more difficult today because we're struggling now for genuine equality. And it's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee a livable income and a good solid job. It's much easier to guarantee the right to vote than it is to guarantee the right to live in sanitary, decent housing conditions. It is much easier to integrate a public park than it is to make genuine quality education a reality. And so today, we're struggling for something which says we demand genuine equality. It's not merely a struggle against extremist behavior towards Negroes. And I'm convinced that many of the very people who supported us in the struggle in the South are not willing to go all the way now. I came to see this in a very difficult and painful way in Chicago the last year where I've lived and worked. Some of the people who came quickly to march with us in Selma and Birmingham weren't active around Chicago. And I came to see that so many people Connor and Jim Clark toward Negroes rather than believing in genuine equality for Negroes. And I think this is what we got to see now. And this is what makes the struggle much more difficult. And so, as a result of all this, we see many problems existing today that are growing more difficult. It's something that's often overlooked. But Negroes generally live in worse slums today than 20 or 25 years ago. In the North, schools are more segregated today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court's decision on desegregation was rendered. Economically, the Negro is worse off today than he was 15 or 20 years ago. And so the unemployment rate among whites at one time was about the same as the unemployment rate among Negroes. But today, the unemployment rate among Negroes is twice that of whites. And the average income of the Negro is today 50% less than whites. As we look at these problems, we see them growing and developing every day. And we see the fact that the Negro economically is facing a depression in his everyday life that is more staggering than the depression of the 1930s. The unemployment rate of the nation as a whole is about 4%. Statistics would say from the Labor Department that among Negroes it's about 8.4%. But these are the persons who are in the labor market, who still go to employment agencies to seek jobs, and so they can be calculated. The statistics can be gotten because they are still somehow in the labor market. But there are hundreds of thousands of Negroes who have given up. They've lost hope. They've come to feel that life is a long and desolate corridor for them with no exit sign. And so they no longer go to look for a job. There are those who would estimate that these persons, who are called the discouraged persons, these 6 or 7% in the Negro community, that means that unemployment among Negroes may well be 16%. Among Negro youth in some of our larger urban areas, it goes to 30 and 40%. So you can see what I mean when I say that in the Negro community, there is a major, tragic, and staggering depression that we face in our everyday lives. Now, the other thing that we've got to come to see now that many of us didn't see too well during the last 10 years, that is that racism is still alive in American society and much more widespread than we realized. And we must see racism for what it is. It is a myth of the superior and the inferior race. It is the false and tragic notion that one particular group, one particular race, is responsible for all the progress, all the insights in the total flow of history. And the theory that another group or another race is totally depraved, innately impure, and innately inferior. In the final analysis, racism is evil because its ultimate logic is genocide. Hitler was a sick and tragic man who carried racism to its logical conclusion. And he ended up leading a nation to the point of killing about 6 million Jews. This is the tragedy of racism because its ultimate logic is genocide. If one says that I am not good enough to live next door to him, if one says that I am not good enough to eat at a lunch counter, or to have a good, decent job, or to go to school with him merely because of my race, he is saying consciously or unconsciously that I do not deserve to exist. To use a philosophical analogy here, racism is not based on some empirical generalization. It is based rather on an ontological affirmation. It is not the assertion that certain people are behind culturally or otherwise because of environmental conditions. It is the affirmation that the very being of a people is inferior. And this is the great tragedy of it. I submit that however unpleasant it is, we must honestly see and admit that racism is still deeply rooted all over America. It is still deeply rooted in the North and is still deeply rooted in the South. And that leads me to something about another hour, or because Negroes engaged in riots in Watts, for instance. The fact is that the state of California voted a fair housing bill out of existence before anybody shouted Black Power or before anybody rioted in Watts. It may well be that shouts of Black Power and the riots in Watts and the Harlems and the other areas are the consequences of the white backlash rather than the cause of them. What is necessary to see is that there has never been a single solid, monistic, determined commitment on the part of the vast majority of white Americans on the whole question of civil rights and on the whole question of racial equality. This is something that truth impels all men of goodwill to admit. It is said on the Statue of Liberty that America is a home of exiles. It doesn't take us long to realize that America has been the home of its white exiles from Europe, but it has not evinced the same kind of material care and concern for its black exiles from Africa. What I'm trying to get across is that our nation has constantly taken a positive step forward on the question of racial justice and racial equality, but over and over again at the same time, it made certain backward steps. And this has been the persistence of the so called white backlash. In 1863, the Negro was freed from the bondage of physical slavery, but at the same time, the nation refused to give him land to make that freedom meaningful. And at the same period, America was giving millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that America was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor that would make it possible to grow and develop, and refuse to give that economic floor to its black peasants, so to speak. This is why Frederick Douglass could say that emancipation for the Negro was freedom to hunger, freedom to the winds and rains of heaven, freedom without roofs to cover their heads. He went on to say it was freedom without bread to eat, freedom without land to cultivate. It was freedom and famine at the same time. Wow. I'll hold right there for a minute. Hopefully, you're getting what my purpose was, is that at different moments you had to say, this was Martin Luther King talking? Because all we have gotten on his birthday and during Black History Month, the same tired lines from the I Have a Dream speech. And even then, they seldom in the mainstream media have even let that entire speech be heard, because they control the narrative. And that means that once he was murdered, there was an effort made, and still continues to this day, to whitewash Martin Luther King and control what would be known about him to the future generations. That's why I wanted you to see photos of him in all different kinds of ways, and especially with Coretta, and some of them are just endearing, aren't they? As you're listening to me right now, and you look at some of these photos, and again, he was 39 years old. And when we look at where we were, and that's a great photo. I happen to work at Kennedy King College, and it's named for Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy because they were killed within months of each other. Most people, even students at the school, which I constantly work at making sure that it's known, most people think it was named after John F. Kennedy, but it wasn't. It was named after Robert. And wow, I look at some of these pictures with Martin and Coretta, and they managed to have some great moments. That photo right there that you just saw, there's a lot of misunderstanding about that photo because there's another photo that shows Martin up on that balcony and Jesse Jackson and some other people. And people think that that's the same photo or the same time period as when he was shot. And in actuality, it wasn't. The photo with Jesse up on the balcony was taken a day before he was killed. And the photo of when he was shot and all the people up on the balcony are pointing, Jesse's not in that photo because Jesse was downstairs, you know. But historically, it has become confused for those who don't know any better because they assume that Jesse was right there when he was shot. He wasn't. But that's a whole nother story. I'm going to share a little bit more, and then I'll be finished with part one because I just wanted to open up your minds to the idea that Martin was very militant. And for those who weren't around, it's important for them to know that white media, they hated Martin. They dogged Martin all the time. And J. Edgar Hoover, who at that time period was one of the most powerful people in the government of the United States, he was the head of the FBI, he hated Martin Luther King. And he considered Martin to be one of the most dangerous people in this country. Okay? And we should never forget that. After he was murdered, however, they all acted like they just loved Martin. In fact, it's not funny, but it's kind of sad in a way. In the black community, you have something different. Many of the same people who, when he was alive, didn't do nothing whatsoever to advance the struggle. But after he was dead, millions of black people swear him down. They march with Martin. House with Martin. That photograph right there is when Martin Luther King was in the hospital when he was stabbed. In fact, that's something a lot of folks don't even know. There was a black woman who stabbed him when he was in New York City I think at a book signing, and she stabbed him, and it was like an inch from his heart. It's famous. He talked about that too in the last speech he gave the night before he was killed too. So if you've never seen it, you should go check it out. They call that the mountaintop speech. But yes, they later said that she had a mental illness. They put her in a mental institution. And I've tried to find out what happened to her because I've never felt that it was just the idea of some crazy woman decided she wanted to kill Martin Luther King. You know. By the way, if you didn't know this, there's something else to research. Martin Luther King's mother was shot to death in a church in Atlanta, by a black man that they said was crazy. Check that out as well. Yeah, most people don't even know that. Say, how could you have been killed in the church? Because he went up in there and shot up the church and he shot his mother and killed her. Okay. Um, I'm gonna continue with a little bit more of the speech he gave in at Stanford, and I'm gonna read the last paragraph of it. By the way, there's a candidate running for president named Andrew Yang, and he's an advocate of what he calls, I think he calls it guaranteed income. That he says that the government should give everybody a minimum guaranteed income. But I want you to listen to what Martin Luther King said 40 years ago. Wait a minute, let me see. 1967, 1968. Yeah, it was 50 years ago. Okay. Um, okay, yeah, here's what I wanted to mention. In 1875, the nation passed a civil rights bill and refused to enforce it. Let me say that again. In 1875, the nation passed a civil rights bill and refused to enforce it. In 1964, the nation passed a weaker civil rights bill, and even to this day, that bill has not been totally enforced in all of its dimensions. The nation heralded a new day of concern for the poor, for the poverty stricken, for the disadvantaged, and brought into being a poverty bill. And at the same time, it put such little money into the program that it was hardly, and still remains hardly, a good skirmish against poverty. For those that don't know, Johnson and them, President Johnson and them, declared a war on poverty. Funny thing was is that people noticed every time the United States declared a war on something, it got worse. They declared a war on poverty, more people got poor. They declared a war on drugs, more drugs. So hey, um, white politicians in suburbs talk eloquently against open housing, and in the same breath contend that they are not racist. And all of this, and all of these things tell us that America has been backlashing on the whole question of basic constitutional and God given rights for Negroes and other disadvantaged groups for more than 300 years. So these conditions, existence of widespread poverty, of slums, and of tragic conditions in schools and other areas of life, all of these things have brought about a great deal of despair and a great deal of desperation, a great deal of disappointment, and even in the Negro communities. And today, all of our cities confront huge problems. Many, in moments of deep bitterness, engage in riots. I feel that violence will only create more social problems than they will solve. That in a real sense it, that in a real sense it is impractical for the Negro to even think of mounting a violent revolution in the United States. But at the same time, it is as necessary for me to be as vigorous in condemning the conditions which cause persons to feel that they must engage in riotous activities as it is for me to condemn riots. I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air, but in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so, in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these reoccurrence of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. Hmm. Now, let me go on to say that if we are to deal with all the problems that I've talked about, and if we are to bring America to the point that we have one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, there are certain things we must do. The job ahead must be massive and positive. We must develop massive action programs all over the United States of America in order to deal with the problems that I have mentioned. Now, in order to develop these massive action programs, we've got to get rid of one or two false notions that continue to exist in our society. One is the notion that only time can solve the problem of racial injustice. I'm sure you've heard this idea. It is the notion almost that there is something in the very flow of time that will miraculously cure all evils. And I've heard this over and over again. There are those, and they are often sincere people, who say to Negroes and their allies in the white community that we should slow up and just be nice and patient and continue to pray. And in 100 or 200 years, the problem will work itself out because only time can solve the problem. I think there's an answer to this myth, and it is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I'm absolutely convinced that the forces of ill will in our nation, the extreme rightists in our nation, have often used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill. And it may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words of the bad people and the violent actions of the bad people, but the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that social progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so we must help time, and we must realize that the time is always ripe to do what is right. Now, there's another notion that gets out. It's around everywhere. It's in the South, it's in the North, it's in California, and all over our nation. It's the notion that legislation can't solve the problem. It can't do anything in this area. And those who project this argument contend that you've got to change the heart and that you can't change the heart through legislation. Now, I would be the first one to say that there is a real need for a lot of heart changing in our country. And I believe in changing the heart. I believe in the need for conversion in many instances and regeneration, to use theological terms. And I would be the first to say that if the race problem in America is to be solved, the white person must treat the Negro right. Not merely because the law says it, but because it's natural, because it's right, and because the Negro is his brother. And so I realize that if we are to have a truly integrated society, men and women will have to rise to the majestic heights of being obedient to the unenforceable. But after saying this, let me say another thing which gives the other side, and that is that although it may be true that morality can't be legislated, behavior can be regulated. Even though it may be true that the law cannot change the heart, it can restrain the heartless. Even though it might be true that the law cannot make a man love me, it can restrain him from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important also. And so while the law may not change the hearts of men, it can and does change the habits of men. And when you begin to change the habits of men, pretty soon the attitudes will be changed. Pretty soon the hearts will be changed. And I'm convinced that we still need strong civil rights legislation. Wow. And there's a bill before Congress right now to have a national or federal open housing bill, a federal law declaring discrimination in housing unconstitutional, and also a bill to make the administration of justice real all over the country. And nobody can doubt the need for this. Nobody can doubt the need if he thinks about the fact that since 1963, some 50 Negroes and white civil rights workers have been brutally murdered in the state of Mississippi alone. But no one has been convicted. And so there is a need for a federal law dealing with the whole question of the administration of justice. Um, Now, there's another thing that I'd like to mention as I talk about the Massive Action Program, and time will not permit me to go into specific programmatic action to any great degree. But it must be realized now that the Negro cannot solve the problems by himself. There again, there are those who always say to Negroes, why don't you do something for yourself? Why don't you lift yourself by your own bootstraps? And we hear this over and over again. Now, certainly there are things that we must do for ourselves and that only we can do for ourselves. Certainly we must develop within a sense of dignity and self-respect that nobody else can give us. A sense of manhood, a sense of personhood, a sense of not being ashamed of our heritage, not being ashamed of our color. It is wrong and tragic of the Negro ever to allow himself to be ashamed of the fact that he is black or ashamed of the fact that his home, his ancestral home, was Africa. And so there's a great deal that the Negro can do to develop self-respect. There's a great deal that the Negro must do and can do to amass political and economic power within his own community and by using his own resources. And so we must do certain things for ourselves. But this must not negate the fact and cause the nation to overlook the fact that the Negro cannot solve the problem himself. A man was on the plane with me several weeks ago, and he came and talked with me, and he said, the problem that I see with what you are all doing is that every time I see you and other Negroes, you're protesting and you're not doing anything for yourselves. And he went on to tell me that he was very poor at one time, and he was able to make it by doing something for himself. Why don't you teach your people, he said, to lift themselves by their own bootstraps? And then he went on to say other groups face disadvantages, the Irish, the Italians, and he went down the line. And I said to him, that it does not help the Negro. It only deepens his frustration upon feeling insensitive people to say to him that other ethnic groups who migrated or were immigrants to this country less than 100 years ago or so have gotten beyond him, and he came here some 344 years ago. And I went on to remind him that the Negro came to this country involuntarily in chains, while others came voluntarily. I went on to remind him that no other racial group has been a slave on American soil. I went on to remind him that the other problem that we have faced over the years is that this society placed a stigma on the color of the Negro, on the color of his skin, because he was black. Doors were closed to him that were not closed to other groups. And I finally said to him that it's a nice thing to say to people that you ought to lift yourselves up by your own bootstraps, but it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps. And the fact is that millions of Negroes, as a result of centuries of denial and neglect, have been left bootless. And they find themselves impoverished aliens in this affluent society. And there's a great deal that society can and must do if the Negro is to gain the economic security that he needs. Now, one of the answers, it seems to me, is a guaranteed annual income, a guaranteed minimum income for all people and for all families in our country. It seems to me that the civil rights movement must now begin to organize for the guaranteed annual income, begin to organize people all over our country and to mobilize forces so we can bring to the attention of our nation this need and this something which I believe will go a long way toward dealing with the Negro's economic problem and the economic problem which many other poor people confront in our nation. That was Martin Luther King Jr. 50 years ago, he was talking about a guaranteed annual income. You see, when Coretta Scott King said, they didn't kill my Martin over I Have a Dream, they killed my Martin over the other America. I'm going to end for now, and I hope that I've inspired you to maybe go and look up. Just put in the other America, comma, Martin Luther King, and you'll find, you can even find some, he did this basic speech at different places in that last year of his life. Um, and I'm quite sure you'll find some video and some text of him talking to various places about the other America. And that's why it's been buried. All they want you to know is, I have a dream. Okay? And they have pushed this and pushed this and pushed this until what has actually happened is that a lot of people, black people as well, have no real understanding to what Dr. King was doing and what he and all the people that was part of the movement were doing. Um, it's kind of sad in a way because when he 39, 39. If you had been killed or you had died when you were 39, if you're older than 39, if you're watching, listening to this, if you had, if your life had ended when you were 39, what would you have accomplished? And I say that not in meanness, but simply saying if we're still here, we got time. We got time to do something. And as we sit in this America in 2019, when this is being recorded, we're going to go now. And as always, I say, no justice, no peace, no love. KNOW.